almost suffering assassination. He came to really realize that his life was in God's hands.
He wasn't afraid to read those things because he was so confident in what he believed in God.
The last thing that the communist government wanted was John Paul II, now with a worldwide megaphone.
Have you ever wondered what goes on in the mind of a pope? Well, today's episode kicks off the St. John Paul II series in conjunction with the St. John Paul II National Shrine in Washington, D.C., and I'm so excited for this episode. We're bringing on Dr. Grattan Brown, who's the Director of Mission and Ministry at the St. John Paul II National Shrine. But not only that, he holds over 20 years of experience teaching topics such as St. John Paul II, as well as holding doctorate degrees in theology and English. So this guest is certainly no one to bat an eye at. He is so intelligent and so wise. Today we're going to learn all about the interior life of St. John Paul II and really get down to the nitty-gritty of what is going on inside the head of this beloved Pope that we all love so very much. I'm so excited for you to listen, so let's go.
I'm so excited to have you on, so welcome.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Yes, well, just to begin, would you be able to describe a little bit about the spirituality of Pope St. John Paul II? Just give us an overview of maybe some of the things that we should keep an eye out for as we listen.
Yes. When John Paul II was discussing with George Weigel, who wrote 2 biographies, what a biography should be, and he said, people try to understand me from the outside, but you really have to understand me from the inside, by which John Paul II meant people try to talk about me with my accomplishments in the church, in the leadership of the diocese in Krakow, in the church in Krakow, in the political realm, in the cultural realm. But he said, you really have to understand me from the inside, by which he meant he's a disciple of Christ who's given his life to Christ. He's a man of deep prayer. He's Polish, formed in the Catholicism, yes, but in the Catholic culture of Poland. And it's from the inside, from all of that inside, comes all that he does in service to the church and to God. And he was trying to communicate to George Weigel that this is what you have to capture if you're really going to write a biography that describes me. So there's several things to know, which we can talk about. You know, his deep prayer life, influenced by Carmelite tradition and spirituality. His intense intellectual life, intellectual engagement that encompassed theory and the best and maybe some of the mediocre and the worst of modern thought, which he understood as well. The great tradition of Augustine and Aquinas, but also that great intellect applied to everyday life, pastoring his people for decades, and then pastoring the church for 25 years. And then this sort of gift that he made of himself to the church. And that came from the inside too. That was really a gift of love. And as we can see at certain points in his life, a really strong will. We talk about willpower. He had just a stubborn will, but it was a stubborn will directed to a good end, to making the gospel known to really the whole world. So that's what I would sum up.
Right.
John Paul II's spirituality from the inside out.
Right, which it's important to know because now we can read all these things about the Pope and all the things that he did and all the things that he wrote himself, and those are important, but it all stems from his own prayer life. He couldn't have done any of that without a foundation of prayer. So what do you think were some of the most important things when it comes to JP2's spirituality?
Well, first of all, it was his discipleship. He was convinced and confident that God became man in Jesus Christ to speak to us face to face as we can speak, to live as we lived, and to show us how to live well this life so that we enjoy union with him in the next. To suffer, because we do. To die sacrificially, because we sin. And that convinced John Paul II that God was there. God had his back, had the back of the Polish people, of humanity. So there's the first thing. He's through and through a disciple. But that relationship with God builds through prayer. So maybe, and then we'll talk maybe later about that strong will. But here's a good example. When he was, this would have been 1941. The Second World War has just started. The Nazis now rule Poland. And John Paul II has lost his father. He meets a young, I don't know how old he was, frankly, but he meets a mystic named Jan Tyrnowski. Jan Tyrnowski is kind of a shy, demure guy, studied to be an accountant. That proved too much for him, so he worked as a tailor. But in the parish of St. Stanislav Kotska in Debniki, he's in Mass one day, and Jan Tyrnowski hears the priest say, "It's not difficult to be a saint." And he says, "Okay, I'm going to try this." And he adopts a kind of a regular prayer life, keeps a spiritual journal, studies the catechism, and recognizes and starts to communicate to others that the truths of the faith are not just propositions that you read about in catechisms. They're the experience that we can have when we really follow Christ, when we commit to prayer on a daily basis, when we listen to God. And Jan Tyrnowski read the saints on prayer, especially the Carmelites, especially Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila. And then he formed networks of people in really what amounted to cultural resistance to the Nazis. Now, the Nazis wanted to capture the hearts and minds of the Polish youth. And so the Salesian priests in this parish set up religious education for these kids. And then the Nazis carried off all the priests of the parish and either had them shot or put in concentration camps.
Wow.
Jan Tyrnowski was tapped to continue the religious education for all the kids in this parish. And this grew to this network called the Living Rosary that consisted of groups of 15 people led by a leader that Jan Tyrnowski would mentor in the spiritual life, in prayer, in the life of faith, and in leadership, so that these little groups spread out in the society as they grew could educate others in the faith, help each other grow in the faith, mentor people. And Jan Tyrnowski was available to the leaders of these little groups of 15. Well, Karol Wojtyła, the future John Paul II, was one of the leaders in this Living Rosary. And John Paul II takes a number of things away from his friendship and mentorship by Jan Tyrnowski. Number one, lay people can be holy. It's their calling. And look at this guy with this deep mystical prayer life. Number two, these networks of people are the way that the church grows and survives and thrives in the circumstances of whatever circumstances the church finds itself, which in the case of World War II was oppression by the Nazis. And this was the way they mounted cultural resistance. So Jan Tyrnowski really started John Paul II on a deeper prayer life. And John Paul II, over time, himself enjoys mystical prayer. And so anyway, that's when you ask what was going on inside John Paul II
Right.
that led him and made him able to do all of these great things. It was that prayer life, which, it started in his family. His dad was a pious man John Paul II remembers him on his knees in the middle of the night praying, and was a great role model.
Mm.
And then Jan Tiernovsky, with Carmelite spirituality, really set John Paul II's prayer life on a kind of trajectory that powered him through his whole life.
Right, which is so encouraging to hear that this layperson and his dad were the ones who were
Yeah.
influencing him the most, because I mean, then he went on to be pope. So now you have all these different vocations all working together for the sake of sainthood. And I really took that away just from that story you shared about the pope. And you mentioned a couple times this Carmelite spirituality. So for someone who doesn't know anything about Carmelite spirituality, what does that look like? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. To make it simple, you might say there are three moves. There's vocal prayer, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, all the prayers that we say, the prayers of the Mass, the prayers of the Divine Office, vocal prayer. But I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but in the midst of vocal prayer, your mind starts to not wander, but maybe focus on certain thoughts that are important, certain feelings that are important, and you naturally start to meditate on them. So vocal prayer can lead to meditation, where you can present your thoughts and your problems and your opportunities to God in prayer, and you're meditating on them. And this is an opportunity for you and God to, in a way, have a conversation. Maybe you're mad at God and you express that. Maybe you're grateful. Maybe you're just frustrated, or maybe you're excited because there's an opportunity, and whatever it is, you're presenting that in meditation to God. And then sometimes you're just quiet, maybe listening for inspiration or whatever it is. There's a third mode of prayer in Carmelite spirituality, contemplation. And in contemplation, in the Carmelite tradition at least, God's doing all the work. God is giving you in his love. He's drawing you in, uniting you to himself, and probably just giving you his greatest influence to guide you in your own life. You might liken it to a conversation with a good friend, where you go to the coffee shop, or you sit down on, in a couch in the living room or whatever it is, and you start with a little chit chat. Might be kind of like vocal prayer. It's easy. It's easier speech. But that leads to a discussion about things that are more meaningful, maybe a little bit more higher stakes, things that you have to make important decisions about. And there's the back and forth there. It's a little bit like meditation. And contemplation, you might liken to a conversation with a friend about maybe the influence the friend has over you. Maybe always in a good direction if we're comparing it to prayer with God. But, maybe not even so much with words, but in the general impression that comes out of the conversation, leading you in a certain direction, influencing you. And that's the way that conversation with friends happen. I think that's a good analogy to the way that that prayer happens in vocal prayer, meditation, maybe contemplation. Not everyone's a contemplative, but God still speaks to us at that deeper level. And I think that's what comes out of the Carmelite tradition, and what we also see. You can see it in John Paul II's writings as well.
Right. It's kind of something that develops over time. Would you say of like this? It's a deepened prayer. It's like a practice, right? You still have to like sit down and put in the discipline, but a lot of it is almost just a natural progression as this relationship grows.
Kind of like you get to know your friends better and better,
Right.
and their influence on you. Yeah, there's this funny story that always sticks out in my mind from George Weigel's biography, Witness to Hope, about John Paul II praying in the elevator, going up to meet people, world leaders, all the way down to the poor in the Vatican. And I imagine John Paul II in an elevator with, maybe Cardinal Givich, his personal secretary, is there, and other cardinals or other dignitaries, and there he is, praying because he's so used to it and because he has this ongoing conversation with God. Just a little anecdote from John Paul II's daily life as Pope.
Right. And well, isn't that beautiful to know that, he would have this time alone in prayer, but he was also praying around other people.
Yes.
And maybe that's a lesson for us, that we don't have to be so afraid of continuing that conversation with God, even in the midst of being around other people, is not something to just keep to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's lived day in and day out, no matter who you're around, no matter where you are. That conversation with God continues, and probably is rooted in that contemplation, that when you do get that time alone with Him.
Mm-hmm. No, it's both. It's both off in your own room, as the scripture says, but also in the midst of other people, often maybe provoked by what, happens in the moment. And I know that, people today, when they sometimes meet with a difficult moment, they pop out the phone and, scroll or something,
Right.
or calm themselves down or whatever. But a much better sort of prompt would be, I don't know, you could associate taking out your phone with, wait a minute, let me just say a quick prayer, or maybe try to meditate or to bring God into my thinking about what's happening around me. And that could be a way of praying in the midst of others.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to know, what is something that we can learn from the spirituality of Pope St. John Paul II? Like, what are a couple things maybe that we should be bringing into our own prayer lives, uh, and what he would say about that?
Mm-hmm. So I would reiterate then growth over time,
Mhm.
like a good friendship. John Paul II must have had such a great, intimate relationship with God, but then also rely on the saints. John Paul II famously was devoted to Mary, adopting as his motto, totus tuus, all yours. And that goes back to his experience, his childhood experience, certainly, his experience in the war, and his experience almost suffering assassination. He came to really realize that his life was in God's hands. And there's a famous story in World War II. He gets hit by a German truck
Hmm.
and thrown off into a ditch for dead. He obviously survives. And he's taken to a hospital and he's fixed up. But coming out of this experience, he realizes God preserved my life, leading to the obvious conclusion, my life is not my own. Like, it's God that put me here. It's God that kept me here. My life is yours. What shall we do with it?
Mhm.
And it's that kind of devotion that then leads him to discern a vocation. And then later on, as many people know, but not everyone knows, maybe some people in hearing this podcast will hear this for the first time. John Paul is almost assassinated in 1981. By a Turkish man named Mehmed Ali Aka, who's a professional assassin who had assassinated a journalist in Turkey a couple of years before. Shot John Paul II with a pistol at point blank range. It did not. It struck his abdomen. He almost bled to death. But it was a fraction of an inch from the artery going up, the abdominal artery. It missed it, but by a fraction of an inch. Same with the spinal column. So in John Paul II's telling, one finger fired, but another guided the bullet.
Mm-hmm.
He then goes to Fatima the next year to place one of the bullets in the crown of Our Lady of Fatima. And not as many people know this. There was another assassination attempt at that time. And
Really? I didn't know that.
No, it was a Spanish priest that tried to stab him with a bayonet. Now, this one was not as grave because he didn't actually touch John Paul II, but that was the second attempt. And John Paul II knew that not only was his life not in his own hands, but that Mary had his back, protecting him.
Mm-hmm.
And one last anecdote that I'll add to this, maybe to show you that it's not just the extraordinary events like an attempted assassination, but it's really every day that John Paul II knew that his devotion to Mary was really protecting him. When he became Pope, he asked for a community of Polish sisters to come and keep the papal household and to cook the food. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'll bet it was not just because he liked Polish food. He knew that the communists had spies in the Vatican. He knew from his time in Poland that some priests sided with the communists. They maybe were self-protective. And that in any case, whether they be priests or other people, the communists had cultivated intelligence assets, let's call them that, in the Vatican. And that the last thing that the communist government wanted was John Paul II, now with a worldwide megaphone, after they had had so much trouble with him in Poland. Also, when he became Pope, he commanded that all of the mail addressed to him be delivered unopened to his personal secretary, Stanislaw Dziwisz, and that at the end of the day, they would meet, he and then Monsignor, later Bishop, later Cardinal Dziwisz, would meet at the end of the day. They would go back over the day, they would open the mail, and they would sort of think about, what's the future. But they didn't want the mail opened by others because they didn't know what, they couldn't be sure that what was written there wouldn't get be seen by the wrong eyes. So he was prudent, as well as being fearless, not in the sense that he didn't feel fear, but that he didn't let it guide his decision making.
I mean, I'm just so amazed by him. I mean,
Yeah.
let's take a second to look over this, right? He's young, grows up in communist Poland,
Yeah.
almost dies then, lives through an attempted assassination. He is there as literally his entire family dies when he's young. He is so aware of his own mortality. There's no way that he
Yeah.
wasn't. And to see that impact him, because, I mean, really, when things like that happen to someone, you can go two ways, two very extreme ways. It's either you recognize that your own mortality is actually a gift and that there's life beyond this, or you're faced with the fact that you don't want to accept that and you'd rather take it into your own hands because you don't trust God with it. And so it's so beautiful to see how he chose to trust God even in that and didn't let fear overtake him, that he just leaned into what God had for him. And it's such a good example of that. And maybe from your own reflections, or if there's anything that he wrote about, how do you think that recognition of his mortality, or that his life was not his own, impacted his spirituality?
Well, I'll answer that question by responding to the point. You can easily become cynical, and you can easily wander off into a life of just pleasure. I can't really be happy with the society around me. I'm just gonna search for whatever it was that makes a person happy. And there was a fellow priest John Paul II was a professor with at the University of Lublin, a scholar of Hinduism, and John Paul II was there teaching ethics. And that professor went to, I forget, I think it was maybe it was, I forget which bishop, maybe Cardinal Wyszynski, who was the cardinal primate, or the top bishop in Poland during that time. And he says to the bishop, "You should make Wojtyła a bishop because he's holy and he's wise. When I get up in the morning, he's already in the chapel in prayer, and I go and I smoke my cigarette. And when I'm done with my cigarette, he's still there praying." So he was not only a man of deep prayer, but he also had a keen intelligence. And God gave him an abundance of talent, more, probably. He's like one of those people that comes along maybe once a millennium, once every 500 years. He was a great student when he was a kid, but he wore it lightly. He didn't lauded over other people. He didn't make people feel dumb. In fact, he was interested in other people, try to draw them out, share their experience, and he learned from that too. He had a great mind, though, for understanding the ideologies of the time, how they compromised our view of the human person with practical consequences, that certain ideas led to certain practices and by certain regimes that so eroded the dignity of the human person that those regimes could not stand. And the ideologies beneath them had to be attacked. And so John Paul II not only read deeply in the Catholic tradition, but also modern philosophy and the ideologies of the time. So, for example, he not only wrote his theological thesis on St. John of the Cross, the Catholic tradition. He wrote a dissertation on Max Scheler, a modern philosopher. And when he was elected Pope during the conclave, he had there a Marxist journal because he was keeping up with the thought of the enemy, the opposition, so that he understood the way they thought. And then he spent hours and hours and hours in confession so that he understood what people were struggling with. When he lectured, and when he took an interest in the students that he taught at the University of Lublin, he understood their struggles, their experiences, their aspirations. He started a really innovative youth ministry at St. Florian's Parish in Krakow, where he formed lay people into Gregorian chant choirs. And these are pretty well known today, but they were non-existent in Poland at the time and probably most other places because it was the monks who did the chanting. Lay people didn't do that. But John Paul II says, we're going to get young people together. We're going to teach them chant. They're going to get to know each other. They're going to become friends. They're going to grow in faith together. And so that brilliant mind understood the Catholic tradition, modern philosophy, the strengths and the weaknesses, the ideologies of the time, and the practical struggles and opportunities that the people around him were looking at. And he could guide them. And then famously, he developed a network. So if we're talking about his spirituality, right, there's not only the prayer and the sort of wise intelligence, but also the ability to form communities around himself. And he would lead those young people up into the mountains where they could be away from the Nazis and later the communists. And these trips were more after the Second World War under communism than they were during the World War. They would go up the mountains. They would celebrate Mass. They would be away from the communist authorities that were looking at them and listening to them, and they could speak freely. And John Paul II would talk to them for hours, understanding them and trying to guide them, right? So he would say, he had a great, in his spirituality, great respect for freedom, guided by the truth and guided by wisdom. And so confession with Father Wojtyła could take an hour or so.
Mm-hmm.
And they would talk, and he would give them some guidance, and then he would say, now you must decide about, what course you're going to take with the decision that you're facing right now. And that was wise, because that person needs to own that decision, because whatever the consequences of that decision are going to be, that's going to be their life that is doing it, that they're living. So that great intelligence that he had made him a very effective minister, guide, coach, maybe we would say today. I guess we would say, if we're talking about what happened on the inside of John Paul II make him so effective on the outside, that wise intelligence would be part of it.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I had a thought, and I want to know what you think about this, because I'm hearing about the intelligence, and I think it is partially intelligence, but I also wonder if it is coupled with the sense of bravery
Mhm.
that the Pope had. And when I say that, I'm thinking of the things that he faced, and that when we face difficulties, as we were saying earlier, when we're faced with an uncomfortable moment, instead of turning to prayer, maybe we turn to our phones, maybe we turn to food, we turn to other people for comfort, instead of turning to God first. And I even see that when we think about, like, we don't want to think because we don't want to be faced with our own sinfulness. We don't want to be faced with the bad things of the world around us or life's difficulties. So then we turn to other things so we don't have to think about it at
Mhm.
all. And I think about the Pope's deep contemplative life.
Mhm.
He he read, like, the as you were saying, the philosophies of people who did not align with anything that he thought,
Mhm.
and was very much integrated into that and read those things. And I think that, like, would we want to read those things because we wouldn't want to face the opposition, because then we'd have to be faced with the fact that we have to be even more confident in what we believe.
Yeah.
But he wasn't afraid to read those things because he
Yeah.
was so confident
Mhm.
in what he believed in God. So that just makes me wonder. It was this intellect too that he had. Like, he was
Mhm.
very, very smart. But I also think it was coupled maybe with the sense of bravery, because he
Mhm.
wasn't afraid to face what the opposition was, or what maybe Satan's trying to
Mhm.
plague us with, because he was so confident in what God had in store for him instead.
Yeah, beneath bravery is the willingness to suffer,
Mm-hmm.
which he knew in spades from the very beginning of his life. Um, he lost his family early on. His mom when he was just about to receive First Communion. Then his brother was a doctor, died of tuberculosis caring for patients when Wojtyła was a teenager, and then lost his father right at the beginning of World War II, excuse me. Um, and then, so to your point, part of grappling with the ideologies of the time, with your own problems, with other people's problems, is just being confused. And that's a form of suffering too.
Hmm.
And rather than run from it, rather than escape into, I don't know, food or pleasure or whatever it is, you kind of got to sit with it and work on it and push through it. If you do, eventually you'll get to some clarity, especially if you practice prayer on a daily basis, because you've got that habitual conversation with God that John Paul II had through his whole life, that all the saints have. And if his willingness then to suffer confusion, to suffer threats, um, to then suffer disease toward the end of his life, um, sort of gave him the ability to, sort of commit himself to the best that God would propose to him in prayer. Like, what is the greatest thing that we can do today? God, is the kind of thing you imagine John Paul II saying. And then he goes and does it. But often involves suffering, which he's willing to accept, which becomes a kind of superpower, we would say today.
Right.
Like, if I can accept this suffering, look what good I can do in the world. So first of all, we'll talk about, what he did, then maybe we could talk about what he wrote about suffering. When he was a seminarian in World War II, it was an underground seminary because the Nazis prohibited the ordination of priests, seminary formation. So it had to go underground. Some of his fellow seminarians were rounded up and shot. We talked about the threats from assassination and killing. Later on in his life, he contracts Parkinson's disease that slowly robs him of his mobility, his ability to speak, not his mind, which remained sharp until the end. But he did not shy away from the public light, which shone at him from every corner of the globe, but continued to suffer in public. So he, by being willing to suffer, he came to understand its depths, also its possibilities, and ultimately how God would get him through it. Because he knew it was God that was going to get him through it and not his own strength, which was waning physically and probably spiritually. Just to give one quick last example of something he did. He famously in the year 2000 for the Jubilee went to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage. And he led the church into the third millennium following the steps of Christ in the places where Christ walked. So he found himself in what must have been an exhilarating moment on the Mount of Beatitudes, preaching to about 100,000 people, mostly young people, saying, listen to God, dream big, take some responsibility and go do it. And then also in that same pilgrimage, he goes to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Israel, where he greets and spends time with and honors those who he greets the Jewish leadership of the time and honors those who lost their lives in World War II at this Holocaust memorial. And he says the soul feels a deep need for silence to remember, but to remember with a purpose so that we can commit that none of these things, what happened to those people, will happen again. But imagine the difficulty and the suffering to go and to put oneself there in that space and speak to people who have suffered so much. So his willingness to suffer enabled him to do some really profound things. And the last thing I'll mention, he wrote a great letter on suffering, which name escapes me at the moment. It's something like Salvifici Dolores is the name of it, Salvifici Dolores. And it's a reflection on Christ's suffering and how he who is perfect suffers more because of his perfection. Like Christ is perfectly good. And to have to suffer while being perfectly good is in a way a deeper suffering, the suffering of the perfectly innocent. We understand how people suffer for their own foolishness, and sometimes, criminals have to suffer the punishment for their actions. And there's a certain justice to that, even though we want to lean on mercy. But his John Paul II explored suffering by looking at Christ and meditating on how, just how much deeper Christ suffered than we do. And we can follow Christ there, and he will bring us through it.
That's so beautiful, right? Like just so encouraging to know how much Pope St. John Paul II suffered and yet how much he overcame. I would love to know if there's some hallmarks or some takeaways that we really want to hit home with anyone who's listening and maybe needs a little bit of that encouragement.
Well, came to mind is keep your sense of humor. John Paul II had a great sense of humor. There's one, and I'm not going to remember all the details of this story, but at one point he has his Parkinson's is fairly well advanced. He had fallen, broken a hip, and the hip replacement didn't go all that well. So that hampered his mobility and caused a lot of pain constantly when he's, just on a daily basis. And he's meeting with cardinals at the Vatican, and he shuffles in slowly. And he gets to the chair, and he says something along the lines of Italian, si, il muove, which means, look, and yet it moves. Which was funny because that's exactly what Galileo said about the heavens in the controversy about, wait, is it the moon or the earth that revolves around the sun or the sun that revolves around the moon? It's like, well, Galileo said, wait, guys, I know what you're saying. It's moving though. I'm right. And John Paul II cracks a joke and says, look, I'm still moving.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. And I think that is very true. Like you have to understand that I think God even has that sense of humor
Mm-hmm.
with it too. Like you things are serious, but also like you have to understand that there has to be a sense of humor. There has to be a sense of joy
Yep.
even in the midst of that, and that suffering doesn't take away from that joy.
Mm-hmm. John Paul II also had a strong asceticism. And when we think of asceticism, we think a real downer. Like, I don't really want to fast. I don't really want to give away what I've got to others. John Paul II gave everything away. They even tricked him. In by giving away his razor. Yeah, it was his name day, which was kind of like a birthday. And a friend of his said, "I'm going to give him a razor because the razor he uses is so old." But first they took away the razor he'd been using and gave him a new one because he would have given away the new one. The only thing he really kept were his skis, by which he went on winter excursions with those young people that he was mentoring and that formed his early community. So everything he owned had a purpose.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and
Thank you.
sharing all of this. It's been really wonderful to listen to, just to get to know this beloved Pope from a really new perspective in the sense of his prayer life has been really wonderful. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for the invitation.